Hello, my name's David Clarke and I'm going to do a short video for you about setting up EDIUS X for the first time and setting up an EDIUS user ID. So when you've ordered EDIUS X, you'll be given an email which has got a link to download the installer for EDIUS X. Or if you haven't got that, one of the best places to get it is the EDIUS.net website. If you just go to their EDIUS X page, you'll see down here there's an EDIUS download, and you can link there and download the latest installer for EDIUS. It's 2.6 gig because it includes EDIUS and all the extras plus an installer to put everything on there for you, so it's probably the easiest one to use. You can download it directly from Grass Valley and just put on EDIUS and later on download the additional audio filters and new blue title and so on, but this does include everything. Once you've got it, unzip it and you'll be faced with this folder of stuff where you've got the bonus content, which is things like New Blue Titler Pro, Vitascene and Acorn audio effects. There's the installer for EDIUS, but the simplest thing to do is just go straight to this thing, the EDIUS Setup Manager. This puts a program on your computer which will install everything for you and also notify you about updates. So just double click on that to run it, and I'm going to install it, let it go where it wants. Now that it's installed, I'm going to launch it, and you'll notice I'm getting a little pop-up down here with a message, but also it's just going through and checking stuff, and it just so happens there's been a small update to the Setup Manager since I downloaded the package, so I'm going to let it do that. Once that's finished, I'll get on to installing EDIUS, but really it is just a matter of installing it, running it, and letting it do its job. So we'll zip ahead. Now the manager's just updated to whatever the latest one is at the time. It goes through and checks a few things, and then it presents you with this list of things which you can possibly install, which is EDIUS, the DVD menu templates, the manual, and the extras, the audio plugins, Vitascene and New Blue Titler Pro. It hasn't ticked New Blue OFX Bridge, and this one down here, Blackmagic Desktop Video, is greyed out. The OFX Bridge is a way of getting extra plugins into EDIUS. On its own, it doesn't add much to EDIUS. It just lets you use extra OFX plugins if you buy them, which is why it's not ticked as a default, because you don't need it unless you've bought any OFX plugins. If you ever do need it, you can always go back to that original folder and just go into the bonus content and find the OFX Bridge and install it. And you might say, no, I don't need New Blue Titler Pro, maybe I've got this title, so you can always untick it. But at the moment, it's selected those as the things to go in. The Blackmagic driver, it knows that I have got a Blackmagic intensity in this system. Currently, it's got this particular driver on it, 11.5.1. Now, at the time of making this video, there is a later driver out, but this is the latest one that Grass Valley are recommending, so it's probably a good idea to stick with that and not update it. Because on some Blackmagic cards I had a problem with later drivers in the audio. Anyway, it's said that's the stuff I need. I'm just going to click install and let it get on with it. And the nice thing about this is it does everything for you. At the end of this, everything will be installed and you'll be ready to run EDIUS. Now EDIUS at this point hasn't asked me for any serial numbers or been activated, it's just installing everything. It'll ask me for the serial numbers when I start it, after it's been installed. So we're going to let everything install and then get on to the next bit. You might also notice here on my desktop I do have EDIUS 9 installed. EDIUS X is designed to work alongside EDIUS 9, so you can have both of them on there. I would have the latest version of EDIUS 9 installed, but they are designed to work together. You might decide to keep EDIUS 9 just because there are some things it does that EDIUS X doesn't do. In particular, you can't capture DV footage with EDIUS X, and you can with EDIUS 9. Also, EDIUS 9 can rip footage off DVDs and Blu-ray discs, and EDIUS X can't. And those are two sort of old-fashioned things that you might still want, and might be why you keep EDIUS 9 on the system. Even though I have got EDIUS 9 there, I have to admit I don't use it at all. I always use EDIUS X for anything, and even if I'm capturing DV footage, I tend to use a simple free program like Scenelizer, which worked really well. And there we are, now setup has finished. EDIUS and all its other bits and pieces has been installed, and you can see there's a nice shiny EDIUS X icon on your desktop. The next thing to do is actually to start up EDIUS and to activate it. So to activate EDIUS, what you do is you double click on the EDIUS X icon, it starts up EDIUS, and then it asks you to enter in your EDIUS serial number. So this will be the serial number that was sent to you when you purchased EDIUS. If you bought EDIUS 9 with the option for a free update to EDIUS 10, which is called the EDIUS Plus offer, you'll need to have taken your EDIUS 9 number to the edius.net website and requested your EDIUS Plus number. Anyway, what you've got to do now is you've got to stick in your serial number, and then once you've put the serial number in, you click register. If you bought EDIUS Pro, you still won't be able to get into EDIUS without having an EDIUS ID. If you have EDIUS Workgroup, you don't have to make an EDIUS ID, but if you've got EDIUS Pro, you must have an EDIUS ID, and you won't be able to get into it without it. You can make an EDIUS ID just by clicking on this button here, and it'll take you to this web page where you can make an EDIUS ID. Now, I happen to already have one, so all I'd have done is, when asked, I would have put in my email and password and then got straight into EDIUS. But if you don't have one, click on this button, get to the web page, and then go to here where it says EID registration. And an EDIUS ID is effectively such like a user account for any other website that you use. So the procedure is pretty straightforward. You stick your email address in, go down to the bottom of the page, tick I have read the privacy policy after, of course, reading the privacy policy, and then press send. It'll send you an email. You then open up your emails. In this email you'll have a little link. So you click on the link, takes you back to the EDIUS ID page, and then you put in a password. Date of birth, whatever country you're in, and then if we come down to the bottom here, you have the option of just sticking in what field of work you're in, whether you'd like to receive regular updates, and this little one here, which means that when you ever go to your EDIUS ID webpage, whether you'll see your serial number listed as actual numbers or whether it'll be obscured by X's. That's quite a useful one. You can always change that afterwards. But effectively you just confirm. It gives you a quick page just to make sure it's got all your details right. Click register, and now you've made an EDIUS ID. So I'm going to come back to my setup right now, put my serial number in and click register. And then when EDIUS starts, it says put in your EDIUS ID, which will be the one I just created. If you hadn't actually created the EDIUS ID at the previous page, you can always come down to this manage EDIUS ID thing and click on don't have an EDIUS ID, and it'll take you back to the page to make one. But I did, so I've entered my details in, going to click log on, and then I actually get into EDIUS. You do have to make up an EDIUS ID if you have the Pro version of EDIUS. You don't have to have an EDIUS ID for the Workgroup version. It's still a good idea to have a Workgroup version EDIUS ID because it does store your serial numbers as part of the EDIUS ID. The serial number is kind of the most important thing. That's what lets you run EDIUS. So if ever your machine dies and you have to reinstall it, you can always go back and download the installers again, but without the serial number you'll never get it working. And I have had quite a few people come up and say, oh, this has happened, what's my serial number? Because I've forgotten it and I didn't write it down anywhere. With an EDIUS ID it's simple. All you would do is you would pop onto your EDIUS ID page, stick in your email and password, and on your EDIUS ID page you'll have details about your account. Here you can download a trial version. But the most useful thing is this, license list, because in here it will have a list of all of the serial numbers of all of your EDIUSs that you've had. And you only get that if you actually put the EDIUS ID into the license manager. So it is worth doing it for workgroup users because it'll keep your license for you somewhere else. So if you ever need to reinstall, you can just look it up and use the number. You remember there was a little tick box that either showed the serial numbers as numbers or X's. If you didn't tick it when you were setting up the EDIUS ID, you can always go to My Account, Edit Information, come to the bottom of the list, and then just tick or untick Show Serial Numbers as XXX. So as long as that's unticked, it'll show you the full serial number. If that's ticked, you can't see the serial number and you'll have to come here to untick it. Now if I go back to the license list, they're shown as X's. If I go back to my account, I can just untick that box and see what the numbers are. That's the most useful part of the EDIUS ID for me. It saves your serial number, so if you ever need it later, you can find it easily. But that's it. You've got EDIUS installed, you've got all the extras installed, it's activated. Now all you've got to do is put in some settings and start doing stuff. Now in my case I have had EDIUS on this machine before, so it does know that there was some previous projects and I was just reinstalling it as part of this tutorial. You generally have a completely clean thing here and you just click New Project. And the next thing it'll say is, okay, what kind of project settings do you want? So this will set up some basic project settings for you. You can always set up more later on, or you can change these, or you can customize them every time you start up EDIUS. But you do need at least one setting to start with. What I generally do when I'm looking at this is say, right, well, I'm going to need some high definition ones, so I'll tick that. I'm going to need some standard definition ones. Not doing DV anymore, so I don't need any DV specific ones, so I don't bother with that. And I'll want some 4K ones. Now, I'm in the UK, so we use PAL, so I use variations of 25 frames a second, so either 25 or 50. So I'm going to click the 25p one, the 50i one, which is 25 frames a second but interlaced, and the 50p one. So I'm going to want some of those settings. Looking at the colour bit depth, I like to use 10-bit all the time. 10-bit is a higher amount of colour than 8-bit, and it just means if you're doing effects or grading, you should get a better result out of it. A lot of the time you can't really tell the difference, especially if you're filming with an 8-bit source and you're making an 8-bit file like an MP4 file. But I still like to work in 10-bit because I can, and it should come out better. So I will tick that, and I don't bother with 8-bit settings. And then, how many audio channels do you want? This is not how many audio tracks do you want. I might want 15 tracks on the timeline where I can mix my sound effects and natural sound and voiceover and whatever. No, this is how many tracks do you want in your final file, which 99% of the time is probably going to be 2 channels. 2 channels is stereo. 6 channels, for example, is surround sound. Or you might want to make a final file where you split all your voiceover and natural sound and effects off onto different channels, so you might go for 4 channels or 6 channels or something. I talk about this a lot in my full tutorial on why you might use more channels and how you'd set up EDIUS up to use it. So if you just want to make a stereo clip, just choose 2 channels. Again, you can always change this later, and you can make new presets later. Final thing, I'd recommend leaving the overscan size on 0%. Again, I explain what that is in the tutorial. Personally, that's what I would tick. I would then tick next. It'll give me lots of project settings which match the things I've just chosen. So I've got some 4K ones, HD ones, and SD ones. They're variations of 25 frames a second and 50 frames a second. Looking at this lot, I actually don't do anything at 4K 4096, which is kind of cinema style 4K. So I'm not going to bother with that one, and I'm not going to bother with that one. But I am going to keep the quad full HD ones, because that's the kind of 4K that I film in. I'm going to keep a 1280 50p one, but I don't need a 1440 one. 1440 is the kind of size you might use if you're using HDV or XD cam. I'm not. I'm only ever going to use 1920, so I'm going to untick that. Don't really want a 25p 1280 thing. Don't think I'm ever going to use it. But yeah, I pretty much want all the rest. Now, you might be looking at this lot and saying, yeah, I don't really know which of these I'm going to need. Well, what the hell? Just leave them ticked and delete them later if you don't want them. But that's what I do. And I click completed, and now I've got a list of project presets. And I'm ready to choose my first project preset and start a project. I am going to do an HD project, which is 25 frames progressive, because it's going to be popped onto YouTube, so I'm going to choose this one. Once I'm into EDIUS, I can change a lot of these settings. So even if I choose that, I do actually have the option later to change it to, say, 50i, or change it to standard definition, or change it to 4K. What I don't get is I don't get the option to change it from 25 frames a second to 50 frames a second, or from 25 frames a second to 30 frames a second. So that's the really important thing you've got to get right at this stage, is what frame rate do you want your project to be? And this is kind of what frame rate do you want your final video to be? It's not so much what frame rate did you film in, what frame rate do you want the final video to be in? Most of the time that is going to be the same as you filmed in. That's the only thing you've really got to get absolutely right at this point before you start editing. What frame rate do I want? Well, I do want 25p. I'm not doing 50p, so I'm going to choose that. Again, go into that a lot more in depth in the free tutorial, and I also go through it a bit in the free tutorial. But anyway, I'm going to choose that one. You'll notice I do have a button to customize it, so I could actually tick that and change all these at this point anyway. I'm not going to, but I'm going to click OK, and then I'm into EDIUS itself proper. Now, there are other things you might like to do to it. In particular, you possibly want to set up some presets so you can capture stuff. If you're using something like a Blackmagic card, you'll probably want to be able to turn that on so you can use it. But mainly, you could start editing right now. So, suppose I do want to use a Blackmagic card. The way to turn it on is you just go up to Settings, System Settings, Hardware, and under Preview Device here, you'll notice I've got the option of an Intensity Pro, but it's not ticked. So I'm going to tick it, and now I am ready to actually output through the Intensity Pro. Now I have got a little warning message that popped up down here, which said device doesn't support current format switching to software mode. What that means is my Intensity Pro can't actually handle the project setting that I'm in. This is actually an old-fashioned Intensity Pro, and it doesn't work in 10-bit projects. So I chose a 10-bit project and it doesn't work. This card is probably 8-9 years old, so all the modern ones will. Suppose you chose a setting that your preview device doesn't use. You see that thing down there and it just says this device you've chosen won't work with these particular project settings. In other words, change it to ones that do work. If you find that message irritating, you can always untick this little box and then it won't turn up. But that's the first thing. You might want to do that so that you can get output from your hardware, assuming you're in a project that supports it. Second thing to do is if you go to Device Preset, this is where you can set up capture settings for, say, a Blackmagic device or a microphone or something like that. Now, I've got none in here at the moment. I do have some settings you can download on my website, and if you've downloaded those, you would right-click, import, find the settings and import them. But I'll just take you through setting up a simple one here. So the first thing I do would click New. Then I'd give it a name, which means something to me. It's a Blackmagic standard definition 4x3. I can select a different icon for it if I want to, or I can even make my own so I can have some pretty icons on it. Not going to bother. And then you come to this section where you choose the settings. So this is what are you capturing from. It's come up with direct show capture, which the only time I ever use this is with something like a microphone. So I might use that if I'm setting up a preset to let me do voiceover. I'm not going to use direct show capture. I'm going to click on it and instead I'm going to choose my Intensity Pro. Having chosen that, the next thing you can see is input. But nowhere here is there something that says, is it S-Video, is it Composite, what is it? That's because you don't decide that in this dialog box, you decide it in a separate Blackmagic program. So you don't have to worry about setting that up here. There is a little settings thing here, but all it shows you is this big blank screen. The screen wouldn't be blank if you've actually got some video pumping into the Intensity Pro, but that's all this thing will show you. The next thing you've got to do really is choose what kind of video format am I going to capture, and it's set at the moment to 5994 high definition. But if I click on that, I can look through all my possible options, and I am going to choose this one, which is 720 by 576 50i, because I'm trying to do a standard definition 4x3 setting, so that's the closest one. I could choose a 10-bit one, but I'm using an Intensity Pro standard and it doesn't really do 10-bit, but normally I'd probably choose that one if I've got a 10-bit card. Next thing, what do you want to capture it into? Well, you've got an option of uncompressed or any of these things. I always tend to use the Grass Valley settings, so HQ is for 8-bit, HQX is for 10-bit, so I'm going to choose that. Once you've chosen one of those, you can come in here and refine the quality. And I quite like to use fine. I never bother to fiddle with these sliders. If you notice these different presets here change the sliders, I just tend to go for that and just use it. Do you want to capture it as an AVI or an MXF? I always use AVIs because they're very standard. Obviously you might fancy using MXFs, but I just leave that as it is, and in fact for the rest of this here I leave it as it is and I go straight on to the next bit. So really all I've done is chosen the intensity, said it's standard def, chosen Grass Valley HQ and gone next. This hardware output thing is generally for recording back to tape, and there really is nothing to set up with it with a Blackmagic card. The only time I ever used this personally was for recording back to DV, and you don't do DV in EDIUS X anymore, so I don't bother with it. So generally I just click next. And that's it. Quick summary of what you've done. It's ready to go. If I then want to capture from that thing, I go OK, pop up to capture, select input device, there it is, OK, I am now ready to capture. It prompts me for a tape name, which I can either put in or ignore. The other setting that's worth fiddling with there, minor one, you don't have to do it, but if you see your item in the list there and you right click on it, you can say assign input preset, and I'm going to assign it to input preset 1, and then when I come back to the capture heading here, Bosh, there it is. Input preset 1 saves me going to that box. You can assign 5 different settings, so I could make a 16:9 capture setting and an HD capture setting, or if I had a 4K device, a 4K capture setting. But effectively that's it. I'm ready to capture. I can mention the only thing that I haven't set there is the input, which on a Blackmagic device is set in a Blackmagic program. So to find that, I'm going to go down to the Start menu, look through the list, and I find this thing, Blackmagic Desktop Video Setup. Tells me I've got my old-fashioned Intensity Pro, so I'm going to click on the Settings button. And here you can see I've got something for output, something for input, audio, conversions, and the About, telling me which drivers I'm on. On the output side, you'll notice it's saying it's outputting to NTSC. Actually, when you're using EDIUS, you can ignore this because the output itself is set by EDIUS. The only thing you might want to set is what kind of analog output you're getting. So if you're coming out through an S-Video plug, then you'd have to select that. If you're coming out through a component, you'd have to select that. On the input, this is where you decide what hole you're using to capture. So if I am capturing off S-Video, I would click that, and now inside of EDIUS, I would have a picture ready for me to capture. If I'm clicking off Composite, which is the green phono plug on the back of the cables, I'd click that. On conversions, I never bother with that. It's got an option here to convert from high def to standard def and so on. Never bother with that at all. Really, I only pop in here to tell it what kind of hole I'm using to capture off, or if I'm using an analog output, which kind of hole I'm using there. And I can pop into it whilst EDIUS is open, change the settings, come back to EDIUS, start off the capture, and it will have noticed that, and I should get a picture up here and be ready to capture. So the other hardware setting that you might want to set up yourself is one for voiceover. So I'm going to go new, call it microphone. Let's select a microphone icon. Direct show capture. This is my microphone, which is a USB microphone. Now you can pop into the settings and go to here and change the level, but you can also change that afterwards. I can leave it at the default, or I can change it to 48 kilohertz, which more matches my actual project settings. Ignore everything else and go next. Completely ignore the output and go next. Completed. Now I have got a microphone setting. You can only set your microphone setting up when your microphone's plugged in. So if you're using something, say, plugged into the little jack plug on the front of your computer, you got to plug it in before you can set the setting up. I mean, once you've done that, you don't have to change this setting every time you use it, because it'll be ready for when you next plug the mic in. But you make sure your mic's plugged in, then make up a setting, and then you're ready to go. And then, if you want to do something like a voiceover, using the voiceover tool here, you'll notice at the very top here, I do have a setting for microphone, which is now actually listening to me yakking as I'm recording this video. And obviously there's lots of other things you can set up inside of EDIUS. I've got a lot more about all this on the full tutorial. But that's enough to get me going. I've got some capture settings, I've got it set to pop out through my video card, I've got a microphone setting, I've got some project settings. Now I can actually get into doing some editing. Well, that's the end of my short tutorial on setting up EDIUS X for the first time. Please remember to press the like and subscribe buttons and all the other kind of things that people ask you to do on YouTube. You can order a copy of EDIUS X via my website. Now, when you're ordering from me, you actually order direct from the European distributors. And if you look at the links on my website, you'll see that they are all priced in euros rather than pounds sterling. This is because you are buying it from a European web shop. We used to put the price on there in pounds, but actually the exchange rate wasn't that good. So if you buy it yourself in euros and just let your credit card company or PayPal do the calculations for you, it comes out a lot cheaper than if I was to list it in pounds. So just pop onto the website, order it with your credit card. You'll find a rough guide to what the price is in pounds on my website, and of course you can always just look it up at whatever the current exchange rate is. On the website you can also see details of my full tutorial and order that for immediate download. Thank you for watching and see you next time.